Welcome to ArchDaily's interview with GXN. Today we have with us Head of Innovation, Mr. Kåre Poulsgaard. Kåre holds a master's degree in digital anthropology, and he researches how architects can and should close the feedback loop with their buildings. Hi, Kåre.
Hi, Christelle. Thank you for having me on.
How are you?
I'm very well. How are you doing?
You're talking to us from your headquarters in Copenhagen, right?
Yes, we're just starting to open up in Copenhagen again, so we are having a few people come in, being one of them. It's good to be back.
Okay, so let's jump into it. So we're going to be discussing artificial intelligence and the work of GXN. So in general, what can you tell me about artificial intelligence and architecture, and how can the impact of artificial intelligence be in architecture?
Yes, I think that is a big question right now, and there's a lot of articles and answers to that. I think we're still sort of asking ourselves the same question. We're looking at the field and trying to figure out how to approach it. I think one of the ways we're looking at it is sort of, I like this definition that artificial intelligence is automation on steroids. So what we think about it, when we think about it, is that these are tools that allows us to make sense of the world around us, to understand large amounts of data, to learn from these amounts of data, and to basically give us new answers to some of the questions we have, or can automate some of the processes that we're doing. So we're trying to figure out what that actually means for us, and I think that is a big challenge that are facing a lot of architects. I think it's tricky for us to figure out how to scope and pose problems in ways so that they become relevant for machine learning tools. It's hard for us to find out how to get access to the data. We need to start using these tools. And once we have that, it's of course also going to be tricky to figure out how do we actually get this into our workflow, and what does that mean for our business model. So these are some of the questions we're asking ourselves at the moment around this.
So a lot of people are not very familiar with GXN. Can you please introduce GXN for everyone, and can you tell us how did it all start?
With pleasure. So I guess the best way to talk about GXN is to talk about GXN in relation to our parent company, 3XN. So 3XN Architects is a Danish architecture business. It's been around for 30 plus years, always with a focus on sort of human-centered Scandinavian architecture. GXN has been around since 2007, and there's sort of a good working relationship between the two companies. So the way I kind of like looking at it is if you look at the business model of architecture, what 3XN does, it's very much about moving a project from A to B with as few hiccups along the way as possible. So from concept to finished building, on time and on budget, please, right? So you don't really want to take too many risks, because architecture projects run for a long time. There's a lot of moving parts, there's a lot of partners, there's a lot of money involved. And so open-ended questions, testing out new technologies, all these things add risk to that process, and in that process, risks scale quickly. So you don't really get to ask these open-ended questions in the same way that you can if you organize differently. And so that's where GXN comes into the picture. So we basically get to do all the stuff the architects don't get to do, which is great for us. So we get to go and ask open-ended questions. We get to test out new technologies, get to look into new trends. We get to make mistakes. But the whole point is that through doing all that, we learn about these new trends, these new technologies. We learn from our mistakes and mature and honest to the point where we can then take that learning and bring that back into design for 3XN or for some of the clients that we consult with.
How is GXN working with buildings and data, and what are the outcomes?
So GXN, we have three focus areas that we're looking into. One is digital design. Another one is circular design, applying circular economy to the built environment. And the third one is what we're calling behavior design. And so what we're really looking into in the behavior design cluster is figuring out, how do our buildings impact the people who use them, the people who have their every day in them. And that's something we've been interested in for a while. I think this whole track really started for us with an industrial PhD we hired. She was a psychologist, and we hired her to help us develop a process for understanding what goes on in our buildings. So our own process for doing what we call post-occupancy evaluations, ways of going out and looking at buildings, talking to the people using them, to get information about how the building actually performs, how people actually feel about it, and then bring that back in. So she did a great PhD with us and really helped us start thinking about this. That kind of alerted us to the value of going back to our buildings. So I'm a trained anthropologist. Anthropologists got to do fieldwork. If you want to know something about somebody, you go and hang out with them. And to me, it's crazy that architects don't really get to go back to their buildings more often than they do, because there's so much knowledge out there. There's knowledge about how the design strategies that we are putting in are actually performing. And so there's a possibility for understanding our designs better and for perfecting our design strategies. But there's also knowledge about how our clients actually getting value out of our buildings, things that can help us develop better relationships with these clients. And so from the work that we did with that early PhD, we started thinking about these questions, and now we've created a research cluster, which we call Architecture Shapes Behavior. This is a cluster that's sort of working in between 3XN and GXN. In GXN, we have 3 industrial PhDs working with us now, and we work with them and the designers in 3XN to sort of take what we learned about our own buildings and then apply that back into design processes in the 3XN. So maybe as a sort of very concrete example from this sort of research process and how we bring that back into design. One of the things that the PhD found in the original post-occupancy evaluations we did was sort of really looking at the stairs. So stairs and atrium spaces are a big thing for 3XN. We do them in a lot of our buildings. And what we're trying to do with them is really create a social heart of the building, a place where everybody will sort of go through, see each other, maybe meet each other, have conversations, and really sort of have that experience of being amongst others in a building and be grounded in the building. So it's quite an important strategy. And we were interested in understanding, what do these stairs mean, these sort of big connected stairways, these atriums. And what we found was that in a lot of the buildings, the stairs are actually working as meeting places. So people will come in the morning, you'll meet each other on the stairs, you'll strike up a conversation. But then that conversation kind of stops when you get to, your floor. So what we started being interested in was the landings around sort of the stairwell. And what we're doing now is then developing strategies where we're actually increasing the landing space so that those meetings that people have on the stairs can then be taken to somewhere and where people can sit down and continue the conversation and kind of deepen that meeting that they had from there.
So I want to ask you, can you tell us about some projects ongoing projects that you have with 3XN?
Yeah, so we're doing a lot of work together with 3XN. I think it's kind of exciting to be able to go to clients and present 3XN and GXN together as a package, because we can do these different things. So one of the exciting projects we're doing at the moment is a large fish market in Sydney, the Sydney Fish Market project. It's a large-scale urban regeneration project creating a new fish market in the Sydney Harbour that is not just going to be a fish market, but sort of a destination for locals. So there's going to be a lot of restaurants and retail, destination for tourists, and really sort of a great space to hang out. And what we've sort of approached there is that we have 3XN doing a lot of the design and the development and creating the building, and GXN are then working on the side and working closely with 3XN to drive the sustainability strategy, the sort of human-centered strategies, looking at all the ways that we can add value around the design that 3XN are making.
So I wanted to ask you, does your intervention impact the initial design process also, or is it just occurring after the project is being built?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. It's a question we're sort of still refining in here. I mean, it depends on the project. I think what we are getting better at doing here between 3XN and GXN is actually working together from the earliest stages of the design, where we can really help develop concepts together and start asking some of the questions that we can ask in GXN to get the designers thinking about them, and the designers can challenge us with the knowledge they have about the project and the design that they're doing. So we want to do the collaboration as early as possible. On some projects we come in later. It also depends a little bit on how the project is, but there's a lot of value to be had in starting that collaboration early.
Okay, and can you tell me a bit about the future role of the architect in the midst of all these technologies? How do you think the role of the architect is going to evolve?
Yeah, so they're bringing it back to the question of sort of AI and automation. I think there's an interesting question that's sort of coming up. There's a lot of companies and tools being developed right now, and there's a lot of they're generating quite a lot of buzz, and rightly so. So tools like TestFit, or a company like TestFit, or tools like Finch. So these are tools that are automating parts of the design process. They're basically looking at automating generation of spaces, looking at specific parameters, so quality of spaces, room sizes, the floor plate of a building. So how many rooms can you get in, apartments can you get into a floor plate, these kind of things. I think this is an interesting sort of way of looking at how these tools can make inroads into architecture. I think the interesting question for an architect is how much are we going to be using those tools in the process, and how much are we going to be doing the techniques that we already have and doing what we are good at. So I think that sort of type of problem solving, which is very quantitatively driven, and also to some extent a little bit deterministic because you have some parameters and you optimize towards them, is interesting and can help solve a sub-problem of what we do as architects. But I think there's a lot of other things that happens in the design. So if you go back to what 3XN does, if you talk to the architects here, what they'll tell you is that what architects do really well is sort of resolve complex briefs into beautiful buildings. And I think that sort of resolution of complexity we can see with some of these new AI tools, but the whole beauty side of the equation, the whole design side of the equation is still very important, right? So it's not just about finding the most optimal floor plate, it's also about finding out how that floor plates fit within the building that tells a larger story, that can help generate value for people in more ways than just sort of an efficient layout. And I think this is where architects really excel. And I think there's still a role to be played by architects here. So I guess the question for architects is figuring out, taking these tools, how can we take these tools in to automate parts of the work that we are doing that are taking up time without adding too much extra value, and then spending more energy on the things that we are really good at and that architects are probably better at than most other professions. I think another interesting thing is, one thing is the early design phases. Another interesting aspect, if you look at what an architect does, is sort of that process of bringing a design to a finished building. If it's an ambitious building, there's going to be a lot of different professions involved. There's going to be a lot of different pieces of expertise that needs to be integrated. And traditionally, at least here, that's sort of the role of the architect. We are kind of shepherding the project through that process. And getting all these different professions, all these different people, all these pieces of expertise together in a good way requires a tremendous amount of empathy, to drive that collaborative process. I think this is sort of another key aspect of what architects does that's going to be very hard to automate. So in that sense, I think it's exciting to see how these tools are going to come in and what they're changing. And I do think they're going to be changing things for the industry and potentially also impacting our business models, which we can also talk a little bit about. But at the same time, I think architects need to sort of keep in mind what they're doing and doing really well. That's very hard to automate. And that's that sort of creative resolution of complexity, for example, or that sort of very emphatic or sort of that collaborative process that requires a lot of empathy and a lot of face-to-face interaction and engagement with other people coming from quite different disciplines, and helping them understand the project and them helping us understand the knowledge they come with, and then sort of working that out.
So architectural programs are lacking teachings related to artificial intelligence. How can we learn, in your opinion, more about AI?
Well, I'm not entirely sure I necessarily agree with that statement. I think there's an interesting project that we're doing. This is in the Architecture Change Behavior cluster. This is a project that's looking at using machine vision to help us understand our buildings. I can explain the project in a second, but we're doing that project with the Center for Information Technology and Architecture here at the Royal Academy of Architecture in Copenhagen, and then the Center for Software Engineering at the University of Southern Denmark, and a PhD that we have placed here in the company. So I think there are departments centers, institutes within different architecture schools that are focusing on this, and I think there's probably going to be more of these. And if students are interested in understanding these, I think it's a question of seeking them out. But the project, which is also quite exciting and is really sort of, it's one of our first forays into trying to figure out how we can use these tools. I think to go back to that question you asked in the beginning about what's the challenge that we face as architects, one of the challenges is really figuring out, what sort of problems can we actually solve with these tools? How do we deal with it? How do we get the data? This project is sort of taking a first step towards that. So the idea with the project is kind of scale up what our psychology PhD was doing for us. So traditionally, when we do post-occupancy evaluations, when we go out and look at our buildings, it's quite a qualitative process. And rightly so, because what we're trying to capture are these qualitative aspects that we are adding into our buildings through designs. So we go out, we hang out in the building, we talk to people, take photos, shadow people around, count whoever goes through the spaces. It's quite a long process. It takes a long time, and it can also feel a little bit invasive for the people in the building. So what we're interested in with this research project is figuring out if we can use some of these new tools to automate parts of that process and really scale it up. So we're using machine vision, so object recognition, to recognize not just sort of people moving through spaces. There's already a lot of options out there for that, but trying to then say, so basically if we use these object recognition tools, we can recognize here's a person, not a specific person, but this is a person, here's a chair, here's a computer. And what we want to do with that sort of ability to recognize these people is then start thinking about, can we then, if we combine these people in different ways, code for different situations? So a person moving through a hallway is a person in a moving situation, right? This is a person getting from A to B. But two people walking closely next to each other through that hallway might be a conversation type situation. So can we code for that? Or two people standing close to each other for more than more than 30 seconds, 40 seconds, maybe that's a conversation. Somebody sitting down with a computer in front of them is a working situation, working alone. Somebody sitting around a table like this talking is a collaborative work situation. So the idea here is that we want to use the ability of this software to recognize objects and persons to help them code for the situations we design for. And so use that to count these types of situations within spaces and see if they're actually doing what we think they're doing when we do the design. So it's a way of scaling up that qualitative analysis using these new tools. And I think what we're basically doing with that is sidestepping the data issue a little bit, because we're using open source object recognition databases. So we don't have to necessarily train these tools, but rather use what's already out there. And then through that, we can start generating our own data sets about what happens in our buildings. And that's the other exciting part about this.
So if you want to summarize the GXN approach, what are the main titles that can be highlighted?
Yeah. So as I said, we have these three sections. So we do digital design, looking at how new digital tools can help improve our own workflows and can help us work, for example, new fabrication technologies, machine learning tools, for example, these kind of things. We're doing circular design, which is finding ways of applying the circular economy to the built environment. So finding ways of making the built environment less wasteful, less materially intensive. And then we're doing behavior design, which is this notion of we want to understand what goes on in our buildings, and we want to be able to take that understanding and use that to inform design and create better buildings. I think the exciting thing that's happening right now is that we're sort of seeing crosses between these three sections. So for example, we're using digital tools now to help us understand what goes on in buildings. We're using the knowledge we have about behavior to understand how people might react to sort of circularly designed interiors, or again, using digital tools to inform science fabrication for the circular economy.
Okay, and finally, do you have like one final thought that you want to share with the ArchDaily's audience?
In terms of these tools, I think there's two interesting implications that the architecture profession needs to start thinking about with these tools. And one is, I think architects need to become a lot more data literate. Figuring out what sort of data sources are there, what we do, how do we work with them. So in a sort of traditional design process, I think architects work with a lot of course, professional experience, tacit knowledge from projects, and maybe a bit of gut feel for how to do the designs. I think in the future, we can start, if we can figure out how to get access to the data about what happens in the buildings, we can sort of start amplifying that with actual analysis of what goes on in the buildings and how our different strategies work. And I think that is something that's very important for architects to start thinking about. And I think related to that, the other thing is we shouldn't be letting go of our user experience. And what I mean with that is that today, traditionally, we design a building and we hand that over, and then we are kind of, we don't really have access to that building anymore, right? We don't have a chance to go out and visit the building and really understand what goes on in it. If we want to generate data, if we want to close that feedback loop and get data back to the architects, we need to maintain a relationship with the building owners, with the people in the building. And for that to happen, we need to figure out, how do we keep that conversation going for 10 years, for 15 years, for 20 years? What sort of value can we provide? How can we help users of a building adapt to the building over time, for example? How do we help developers and building owners make the most out of the building once we've done the design, once the building is built, and once it is in use? And if we can get that relationship right, I think it's very exciting times, because that's going to change the business model as well. So rather than sell the building once, so to speak, I think we can start thinking about architecture as a service as well, and thinking about how to amplify the value of the building through continuously improving the use of the building. But for that to happen, we got to get that data back. We got to start thinking about that feedback loop. And so that's really where we are sort of focusing at the moment in GXN and in 3XN.
Thank you, Kåre, for this lovely conversation.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.